3 men are trapped. Mr. Morrison and their families are gathering at the gate. Charles Morrison looked up from the quarterly ledger spread across his mahogany desk. The numbers had been excellent profit margins, surpassing even the previous year's record. His assistant, Gerald, stood in the doorway with that particular expression of controlled urgency that meant something required the owner's attention. "Are rescue operations underway?" Morrison asked, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "Mr. Garrett is coordinating the effort." "Sir, but the families they're asking to speak with you," Morrison nodded, already composing the appropriate words. 23 years in mining had taught him the necessary phrases. "Our thoughts are with you. Everything possible is being done. The company stands behind its workers." He'd delivered such statements before. Not often, Silver Creek Mine maintained better safety records than most operations in Colorado Territory, but often enough that the rhythm came naturally. He stood and moved to the window. His second-floor office overlooked the mine entrance, and from this elevation he could see the small crowd gathering near the gate, women in worn dresses, children clinging to their skirts. The sight stirred something in his chest concern. Certainly, though of what precise nature he couldn't say, the office itself reflected Morrison's philosophy of business: ordered, efficient, immaculate. No dust from the mine shaft penetrated this space. The furniture was fine eastern walnut. The carpet imported from Philadelphia. Even the cold hearth in the corner, unused despite the scorching July heat, spoke to a certain asceticism. Morrison believed in controlling one's environment. "I'll address them shortly," he said. "Have you contacted our insurance representative?" "First thing." "Sir." "Good. And send word to Dr. Hampton that his services may be required." Gerald departed, leaving Morrison at the window. Below, more families arrived. He watched them gather, their grief already forming like storm clouds. Though the rescue had barely begun, Morrison understood their fear. Mining was dangerous work. Everyone knew that when they signed on. The earth gave up its riches reluctantly. He turned from the window and caught his reflection in the glass-fronted bookcase. 42 years old, hair graying at the temples, face showing the success of a man who'd built something substantial. His father had left him this mine 15 years ago, along with a simple instruction: make it profitable. Morrison had succeeded. Silver Creek employed 73 men, supported perhaps 300 people if you counted families. The mine extracted high-grade silver ore, paid regular wages, and turned consistent profits. His father would have been pleased. What his father wouldn't have known, what no one knew, was that Morrison hadn't descended into the mine shaft in those 15 years. Not once. He'd inspected operations exactly one time. 3 weeks after inheriting the property, the cage elevator had dropped him 300 feet into the earth, and Morrison had felt the walls closing in, the weight of rock overhead pressing down, the darkness swallowing all sense of space and direction. He'd lasted perhaps 20 minutes before panic seized his throat and forced him back to the surface. Afterwards, Morrison had hired competent managers, men who understood mining, who could assess conditions and coordinate operations. He'd built a system of reports and inspections that didn't require his presence underground. The mine ran efficiently. No one questioned his methods, no one except himself. In the rare, quiet moments when honesty crept past his defenses, Morrison straightened his collar and prepared to descend, but only to ground level, only to the families waiting for words that would change nothing but might offer some small comfort. He moved toward the stairs, leaving the cold hearth behind. The quarterly report still open to pages showing excellent profits from work he'd never witnessed firsthand. The vertical distance from his office to the mine entrance was perhaps 30 feet. The moral distance, Morrison suspected but refused to examine, might be considerably greater. The families received Morrison's words with silence harder than stone. He stood before them in the late afternoon heat, dust settling around the mine entrance, and delivered his prepared statement. Everything possible was being done. The rescue team was experienced and well-equipped. The company would provide for the families regardless of outcome. He meant every word, or believed he did, but the phrases felt hollow even as he spoke them. A woman in a faded calico dress listened with eyes that had already seen too much grief. She held a child of perhaps 3 years, too young to understand why his father might not come home. Morrison avoided her gaze. A addressing the group as a whole rather than individuals. Mr. Garrett will keep you informed of all developments, he concluded. The company stands behind its workers. No one thanked him. They simply waited. As if his words were an obligation to be endured before the real business of hoping and fearing could continue. Morrison stepped back, relieved to have fulfilled his duty. And that's when he saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the crowd, apart from the families but clearly observing. She wore practical canvas trousers and a work shirt unusual enough to draw attention, and carried surveying equipment over one shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes studied Morrison with something that looked remarkably like contempt. As the families dispersed toward the bunkhouses, the woman approached. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to male spaces, neither apologetic nor aggressive, simply present. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm Katherine Brennan, mining engineer from the Colorado School of Mines. I'm here to assess your operations for the Technical Mining Journal." Morrison accepted her offered hand briefly. "I wasn't aware we were being reviewed. Your manager approved my visit 3 weeks ago." Katherine's voice carried the flat precision of someone reciting facts. "I've spent 2 days examining your operation. The collapse this morning was not surprising." The statement landed like a physical blow. Morrison felt his spine stiffen. "I beg your pardon, your timber supports in the western shaft are inadequate. They should be replaced weekly but haven't been changed in 3 months. Your ventilation system serves perhaps 60% of the active tunnels, and your men work 12-hour shifts, which research shows increases accidents by 40% in the final 2 hours due to exhaustion." Morrison glanced around, ensuring no workers were within earshot. "These are serious accusations, Miss Brennan." "Mrs. H," she corrected, "and they're not accusations, they're documented observations." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket. 3 deaths in the past 18 months. Henry Callahan, timber collapse, Samuel Rodriguez, methane pocket, David Chen, equipment failure, all preventable with proper protocols. "Mining is inherently dangerous," Morrison said. Hearing the defensiveness in his voice, everyone understands the risks, the Earth's risks. Yes, man-made risks are different. Katherine closed her notebook. "I've reviewed your safety expenditures. They're below industry standard. Morrison, well below." Heat rose in Morrison's face, whether from the scorching sun or wounded pride. He couldn't say. To be lectured about his own operation, by a woman no less, in front of his own mine, struck him as intolerable. "These are theoretical concerns from someone who's never run an actual operation," he said. "Safety protocols must be balanced against practical economics. It's easy to demand expensive improvements when you don't answer to investors or carry responsibility for profitability." Katherine regarded him with those steady eyes. "I've worked in mines since I was 20. Mr. Morrison, I spent 3 years underground before university, another 2 afterward. I've breathed bad air, watched friends die from preventable accidents, and seen owners blame workers for their own negligence." She paused. "Can you say the same?" The question hung in the dusty air between them. Morrison wanted to cite his reports, his managers, his 15 years of successful operations, but Katherine's expression suggested she already knew the answer, and any response would only confirm her assessment. "If you'll excuse me," he said stiffly, "I have matters to attend to." "Of course." Katherine's tone remained level, professional. "I'll be in town another week, documenting my findings. I imagine the journal will publish them in the autumn issue." She walked away toward the boarding houses, leaving Morrison standing in the heat with something cold settling in his chest. Not guilt, he refused to call it guilt, but perhaps unease. A sense that something he'd successfully ignored for 15 years had just forced itself into visibility. The 3 trapped miners were still underground. Rescue efforts continued, and Katherine Brennan's words echoed in Morrison's mind louder than the sound of picks and shovels working to free them. Morrison found her at the boarding house after dark, when the heat had finally begun to ease. Katherine sat at a small table in the common room, mine diagrams spread before her, making notations by lamplight. She looked up as he entered but didn't seem surprised. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Brennan," He remained standing, hat in hand. "I've come to address your comments from this afternoon." They weren't comments, they were observations. Criticisms. Then, Morrison struggled to keep his voice measured. "I cannot let them stand unchallenged. You've implied negligence. Incompetence. I've stated facts." Katherine set down her pen. "If those facts suggest negligence, perhaps the issue lies with the facts, not my observation of them." Morrison felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced in the cage 15 years ago, though now triggered by words rather than confined spaces. "Then prove it. I have documentation." "No." Morrison stepped closer to the table. "Show me, not on paper, but in the mine itself. You claim these conditions are dangerous. Take me down there and demonstrate." Katherine studied him with an expression Morrison couldn't quite read. Surprise, suspicion. Finally, she nodded. "Very well. Tomorrow morning, dawn, we'll descend during shift change, but when conditions are most revealing." "Agreed." "Full shift," Katherine added. 8 hours minimum. No special arrangements, and no advance notice to your managers to clean up problem areas." Morrison hesitated. 8 hours underground. The thought made his throat constrict. But retreat now would confirm everything Katherine believed about him, everything he feared about himself. "Acceptable," he said. Katherine began rolling up the diagrams. "When were you last underground?" "Morrison." The question came casually, but Morrison sensed the trap beneath it. "I conduct regular inspections." "How regular?" "I have competent managers who report on conditions. That's not what I asked." Katherine's eyes met his directly. "When did you personally last descend into your mine?" Morrison considered lying outright, considered claiming last month, last year, any answer that wouldn't expose the 15-year gap. But something in Katherine's gaze suggested she already knew, and any falsehood would only diminish him further. "When I inherited the property," he said, 15 years ago." Katherine absorbed this information without visible judgment, though Morrison felt judged nonetheless. She finished gathering her materials and stood. "Dawn. Then, shift changes at 6. Meet me at the main entrance at 5:30. Wear clothes you don't mind ruining." "What should I bring?" "Bring nothing you're afraid to lose." Was from Morrison. She left him standing in the common room, lamplight flickering across abandoned diagrams. And Morrison understood she hadn't been referring to possessions. He walked back through the dark streets of Silver Creek, past the saloons and supply stores, past the workers' housing where families still waited for news of the trapped miners. The rescue continued into its second night. Morrison's managers assured him everything possible was being done. Everything possible. The phrase haunted him now. What if possible meant more than he'd been willing to consider? What if everything required something he'd spent 15 years avoiding? Morrison reached his private quarters, a comfortable apartment above the company office, and tried to sleep. But Katherine's question echoed. "When were you last underground and beneath it?" The question she hadn't asked, but Morrison heard anyway. What kind of man owns a mine he's afraid to enter? No answer came that offered any comfort. Morrison lay awake in the summer heat, listening to the distant sounds of rescue operations, and waited for dawn with the dread of a man who'd challenged someone to prove he was a coward. Dawn came scorching and merciless. Morrison arrived at the mine entrance at 5:30. Having slept perhaps 2 hours, Katherine was already there, checking equipment with the methodical attention of someone who understood that underground. Details meant survival, Mr. Morrison. She handed him canvas work clothes, boots, and a leather belt with clips for lamp and tools. "Change in the equipment shed. Everything should fit." Morrison took the clothes, noting their wear and patches. These had belonged to workers, not management. The fabric still carried the faint mineral smell of the mine itself. When he emerged, Katherine assessed him with a critical eye, then handed him a headlamp. "The wick needs to be trimmed every 2 hours. If the flame turns blue, that's methane. Get to fresh air immediately. If it goes out entirely, don't move. Stay put and call for help." Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he fitted the lamp. He focused on the mechanical process: wick, reservoir, adjustment strap, to avoid thinking about why these instructions might matter. Mine manager Garrett appeared, clearly surprised to see the owner in work clothes at this hour. Mr. Morrison is something. Mrs. Brennan will be conducting an inspection tour, Morrison said, grateful his voice remained steady. I'll be accompanying her. Garrett's eyes widened. Sir, I should prepare. No preparation to hay. Katherine interjected. We want to see current conditions at this, not scrubbed versions. Garrett looked to Morrison, who nodded confirmation. The manager's expression suggested he understood this was irregular, but didn't dare question further. We'll be visiting the deepest operational shaft, Katherine added, the western extension where the collapse occurred. Morrison felt his stomach drop. The western extension ran nearly 400 feet below surface, the oldest, deepest section of Silver Creek Mine. His father had opened that shaft 30 years ago. Yes, of course, Garrett stammered. I'll have the cage ready. The cage. Morrison had managed to avoid thinking directly about the cage, that iron box that would carry them down into darkness. Now it waited at the shaft entrance. Door open like a mouth. Katherine moved toward it without hesitation. Morrison followed, each step requiring conscious effort. Workers passing by stared at the unusual sight of their owner in work clothes, but no one spoke. At the cage threshold, Morrison stopped. The vertical shaft descended into blackness so complete his lamp barely touched it. The metal framework of the cage looked suddenly fragile, inadequate to its purpose. 380 feet, Katherine said quietly, stepping inside. 2 minutes, perhaps less. Breathe steady. Mr. Morrison, the anticipation is worse than the descent. Morrison wanted to ask how she knew about his fear, but the answer was obvious. She'd seen it in men before. Perhaps she'd felt it herself. He gripped the cage railing and stepped inside. The operator, a young man named Williams, glanced at Katherine for confirmation. She nodded. The gate clanged shut. Ready. Mr. Morrison, Williams asked. Morrison managed a nod. The cage lurched, then began its descent. The world above vanished instantly. Lamplight caught rough rock walls sliding past. Close enough to touch. The cage rattled and swayed on its cables. Morrison gripped the railing harder. Feeling the metal bite into his palms, darkness pressed from all sides. The temperature dropped cooler underground, though still warm enough to make breathing feel labored. Water dripped somewhere in the shaft. The sound amplified and distorted by stone. Morrison focused on Katherine's earlier advice, breathe steady. But his lungs seemed unable to find a proper rhythm. The walls were too close. The weight of earth above was too vast. How much rock pressed down on this fragile shaft? How many tons of granite and silver ore balanced on timber supports and engineering assumptions? Halfway, Williams called. Morrison's headlamp revealed Katherine watching him with something approaching compassion now, not pity. She wouldn't insult him with pity, but recognition of genuine fear honestly confronted. Almost there, she said. The cage shuddered, slowed, stopped. Williams opened the gate. Beyond lay a horizontal tunnel stretching into darkness, the ceiling supported by timber beams that looked ancient and weathered. The air smelled of mineral and wet stone, and something else Morrison couldn't identify. Something that suggested depth and danger and the absolute indifference of Earth to human presence. Katherine stepped out. Morrison followed on legs that felt uncertain. Welcome underground, Mr. Morrison, she said. This is where your profits come from. The world below was nothing like Morrison had imagined in his comfortable office. Heat radiated from the rock itself, not the surface heat of summer sun, but something deeper. The Earth's own warmth rising from depths beyond human reach. The air was thick, each breath requiring deliberate effort. Dust hung suspended in lamplight, giving the darkness texture and weight. Water dripped steadily, pooling in low spots, running in thin streams along tunnel floors. Timber supports groaned under their burden, soft sounds that Morrison might have found reassuring on the surface, but here carried implications of stress and potential failure. Katherine moved with practiced confidence, her lamp cutting through darkness to illuminate specific features Morrison had never considered. She stopped at a vertical support beam and pressed her hand against it. Feel this. she said. Morrison touched the timber. It was slightly soft. Yielding under pressure, not firm, like healthy wood should be. Rot, Katherine explained. This post should have been replaced 2 months ago. See the water line. She indicated staining about 4 feet up the beam. Constant moisture, poor ventilation, the wood weakens, and eventually... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They walked deeper into the tunnel. Morrison's expensive clothes were already filthy, sweat mixing with mineral dust to create a grime that coated skin and fabric. His lungs worked harder for each breath. Katherine had mentioned poor ventilation, and now Morrison understood viscerally what that meant: air that felt already breathed. Stale and inadequate, she led him to a junction where multiple tunnels converged. "Watch," she said, and lit a candle. The flame barely flickered, in good air. It should have burned bright and steady. Instead, it struggled, the light weak and wavering. "This entire section has inadequate airflow," Katherine said. "Your ventilation shafts don't reach this deep. Miners working here are breathing air that's maybe 70% as oxygen-rich as surface air. After 12 hours, their judgment deteriorates, reactions slow. That's when accidents happen." Morrison stared at the struggling candle flame. How many men worked in air like this? How many times had he approved operational reports without understanding what the words actually meant? They descended deeper via a secondary shaft. The heat increased. Morrison's shirt was soaked through. His breathing labored. Katherine moved as if this were normal. Routine. Which Morrison supposed it was for her, for the 73 men who worked these tunnels daily. She brought him to a section where rock had been cleared away, leaving an open scar in the tunnel wall. "The collapse," she said. 3 men were working this face when the ceiling gave way." Morrison studied the rubble, the broken timbers, the geometric violence of stone falling where men had stood. He thought of the quarterly report on his desk, the line reading, "Material costs, Q2, which had included timber for supports. He'd suggested to Garrett that they might economize their extend replacement intervals, use slightly thinner posts where stress seemed minimal. "My memo," Morrison said quietly. "I suggested cutting timber expenses." Katherine's expression remained neutral. "Did you understand what that meant?" "I thought..." Morrison stopped. What had he thought? That timber was timber, that managers would maintain safety regardless of budget pressures, that his decisions were abstract rather than concrete. "I didn't think at all, not really." They moved through the tunnels, and Morrison began seeing not geological features but human beings. The young miner couldn't be more than 18, working a pick with determined rhythm. The older man with the pronounced limp, moving slower but with practiced efficiency. 2 partners working in perfect synchronization, one holding the drill while the other swung the hammer. Their timing born from years of shared labor. These weren't line items in a ledger. They were Patrick and Samuel and David and Henry, names Morrison knew from death reports, but had never connected to breathing, sweating, exhausted human beings. "How long do they work?" Morrison asked, watching the 2 partners. 12 hours, Katherine said. 6 days a week. Some take Sunday shifts for extra pay. Morrison tried to imagine 12 hours of this heat, this exertion, this constant vigilance against falling rock and bad air and equipment failure. He'd been underground perhaps 90 minutes and already felt exhausted. They paused to rest. Morrison leaned against a timber post, checking first to ensure it was solid, and drank from the water flask Katherine had brought. The liquid tasted of minerals and metal. "Why do you do this?" Morrison asked. "You could work on surface, survey routes, design structures. Why go underground?" Katherine considered the question. Because someone needs to care about the men who do. Not all owners will descend. Mr. Morrison, most won't. They hire managers to maintain distance, but to make decisions easier by keeping human cost invisible. She met his eyes. "But the cost is real, whether we see it or not." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that she wasn't just explaining her choices but describing his own 15-year failure. "Have I seen enough?" Katherine asked gently. Morrison looked down the tunnel, deeper still into darkness where men worked in heat and danger, while he'd sat in air-conditioned comfort reviewing profit margins. "No," he said. "Show me more." They found Patrick O'Brien during his meal break, sitting on a rock outcropping in a wider chamber where 4 tunnels converged. He was eating bread and cheese, washing it down with water from a tin cup. When their lamps illuminated him, he looked up without surprise, as if visitors were common in this underground cathedral. "Mrs. Brennan," he said warmly, his accent carrying the lyrical traces of Wales. "I wondered when you'd make your rounds down here." "Patrick." Catherine's professional demeanor softened. "May we join you? Please." Patrick gestured to nearby rocks. His eyes studied Morrison with neither hostility nor deference, simply the direct assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating others without illusion. Katherine made introductions honestly. "Patrick O'Brien. This is Charles Morrison, the owner." Patrick's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness suggested recognition of significance. "Mr. Morrison. First time below." The question was simple, but Morrison heard the weight beneath it. "Yes." Patrick nodded. No judgment spoken, but perhaps implied. He broke off a piece of bread, chewed thoughtfully. "Welcome to where the work happens." Then, "How long have you been mining?" Morrison asked, settling onto cold stone. "Since I was 12. Welsh coal mines first. My father and grandfather before me came to America 15 years ago, hoping for better." Patrick smiled slightly. "Better pay. Anyway, the dangers travel well across oceans." Katherine remained quiet, letting Patrick speak. Morrison sensed this was deliberate. She'd brought him here for purpose, though what exactly that purpose was remained unclear. "Mrs. Brennan tells me you've worked Silver Creek for 8 years, Morrison said. 8 years this October." Patrick took another drink. "I've known good mines and bad. This one's in between. Could be better, could certainly be worse." "But Patrick has seen friends killed," Katherine said quietly. "Preventable accidents." Patrick's expression hardened slightly, though not with anger, with something deeper, older. "Robert Collier, 3 years ago. Timber collapse in the eastern shaft. The support post had been weakened by water damage, never replaced. Robert was 42, left a wife and 4 children." Morrison felt the name land like physical weight. Robert Collier. He'd signed the death benefit paperwork, sent condolences to the widow, noted the accident in quarterly reports, but the man himself had remained abstract, a statistic, an insurance claim, a line item under operational costs. "James Park," Patrick continued, 2 years ago, methane pocket in a poorly ventilated dead-end tunnel. James was 26, just married. He'd mentioned the bad air to the shift boss, but nothing was done. "Samuel Rodriguez," Morrison said quietly, remembering Catherine's earlier list. "And David Chen." Patrick's eyes met Morrison's directly. "You know their names. From reports, but not from life." Patrick's voice carried no accusation, only statement of fact. "You never met them, Mr. Morrison. Never saw them work. Heard them laugh. Watched them care for their families. They were expenses to you. Acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit." Morrison wanted to defend himself, to explain the complexities of business management, the necessity of balancing safety against economic reality. But Patrick's weathered face and steady gaze made all justifications feel hollow. "We know the risks," Patrick said. "Every man who descends into darkness knows he might not return. Some risks are the earth's to give stone that breaks when it will, or that hides where it pleases. Those risks we accept. We're miners." He paused, finishing his bread. "But some risks are men's to make," Patrick continued. "Inadequate supports because timber costs too much. Poor ventilation because drilling new shafts reduces quarterly profits. Exhausting shifts because paying for additional workers cuts into dividends. Those aren't the earth's risks, Mr. Morrison. Those are your risks, imposed on us because you've never stood where we stand." Morrison absorbed the words like blows. Patrick spoke without raising his voice, without anger or bitterness, simply stating truth with the authority of someone who'd earned the right through decades of underground labor. "I could fire you for speaking to me this way," Morrison said softly. "You could." Patrick agreed. "And maybe you will." But the truth doesn't change based on who speaks it or who hears it. These conditions kill men. I've watched friends die. I've carried their bodies to the surface. I've told their children that Papa isn't coming home. He stood, brushing crumbs from his work clothes. You asked Mrs. Brennan to show you the mine. I've shown you something more important, the cost of your choices. Patrick gathered his tools, preparing to return to work. His shift wasn't finished. 8 more hours remained, 8 hours of heat and danger and backbreaking labor in tunnels Morrison had never visited until today. Patrick, Morrison said, standing as well. Thank you. The older miner paused, studied Morrison with those direct eyes. Thank me by making changes, Mr. Morrison, not with words, but with timber and ventilation and humane working hours. That's the only thanks that matters down here. He walked away into darkness, his lamp bobbing and fading until it disappeared entirely. Morrison stood in the wider chamber, Katherine beside him, and felt the weight of 15 years settling onto his shoulders with a pressure that rivaled the earth above. Katherine led Morrison deeper still, to the western shaft's furthest extent, the active mining face where the youngest tunnels were being carved from living rock. The noise hit him first, deafening percussion of picks striking stone, hammers driving drill bits, men calling to each other over the industrial violence of extracting ore from earth that had held it for millennia. The heat was almost unbearable. Morrison's lungs struggled to find oxygen in air that felt thick as wool. Men worked the face in pairs and trios, swinging picks with mechanical rhythm born from endless repetition, muscles strained. Breath came in gasps. Sweat poured despite the ventilation fans that barely stirred the oppressive air. Morrison watched one young miner couldn't be more than 19 swing his pick for perhaps the 1,000th time that shift, each impact sending vibrations up through arms that had to be approaching exhaustion. 12 hours of this. Morrison had been underground perhaps 3 hours and already felt his body approaching its limits. His claustrophobia, which had remained manageable in wider tunnels, suddenly surged. The walls seemed to press inward, the ceiling dropped lower, or seemed to perception becoming unreliable in the disorienting dark. Morrison's breath came faster, shallower. The weight of earth above felt crushing, impossible to ignore. 380 feet of solid rock pressing down on timber supports and engineering calculations, and the blind faith that stone would remain where men required it to remain. Katherine noticed but didn't comment. She simply stood beside him, steady presence in Morrison's growing panic. A timber groaned nearby, a sound like wooden bones under strain. Every miner within earshot paused instantly, tools frozen mid-swing. The chamber fell silent, except for the creaking timber. Men listened with focused intensity. Judging danger through sound and experience and instincts Morrison didn't possess. The groaning stabilized, then stopped. Work resumed as if nothing had happened, but Morrison had seen the pause, the collective assessment, the professional evaluation of whether this timber would hold or whether retreat was necessary. These men lived constantly with that calculation, every sound, every shift in rock, every subtle change in air quality requiring instant judgment. Morrison lacked those instincts entirely. He was helpless down here, dependent on others for the most basic survival. The realization was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. He thought of his office, the clean ledgers, the quarterly reports that reduced all this, the heat, the danger, the exhausting labor to numbers on pages. Timber costs down 3%, extraction rates up 7%, profit margins exceeding projections. Behind each number were men like Patrick. Like the 19-year-old swinging his 1,000th pick strike, like Robert Collier and James Park, and Samuel Rodriguez and David Chen. Men whose deaths Morrison had noted with appropriate regret but without genuine understanding. 15 years of approvals and denials and budget adjustments, all made from comfortable distance. 15 years of treating human beings as operational expenses. 15 years of profiting from labor he'd been too frightened to witness. The shame was crushing heavier than the rock above, more suffocating than the stale air. Morrison's knees weakened. He sat abruptly on the tunnel floor. Not caring about dignity or appearances, Katherine knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, neither mocking nor pitying. "Have you seen enough, Mr. Morrison?" she asked quietly. Morrison looked at the miners still working, their silhouettes backlit by distant lamps. He thought of the families waiting above, of the 3 men trapped somewhere in these tunnels, of Patrick's weathered face and absolute clarity. "Yes," he whispered, "I've seen enough." But enough meant something different now. Not sufficient evidence for Katherine's accusations; those had been proven within the first hour. No. Enough meant Morrison had reached his absolute limit and found it shamefully shallow. Enough meant he couldn't bear any more truth about who he'd been for 15 years. Enough meant that some part of him buried beneath pride and fear and comfortable distance had finally, irrevocably broken. The ascent felt like resurrection. Morrison stood in the cage, gripping the railing with white knuckles, as the iron box lurched upward toward sunlight and air and the surface world he'd abandoned hours ago. Each foot of elevation brought relief so profound it bordered on euphoria. His lungs gasped for fresher air, his eyes watered in anticipation of light. When the cage reached the surface and Williams opened the gate, Morrison stumbled out onto solid ground. Late afternoon sun struck him with almost painful brightness. He stood blinking, disoriented, while his eyes adjusted from underground darkness to Colorado summer brilliance. The shift was changing. Exhausted miners emerged from the cage in groups, covered in dust and sweat, coughing from long exposure to inadequate air. They moved with the slow determination of men who'd given 12 hours to brutal labor and needed to reserve what little energy remained for the walk home. Morrison watched them with entirely new eyes. That young miner was someone's son, probably supporting family on wages Morrison approved. The man with the limp had worked despite injury because missing shifts meant missed pay. Those 2 partners weren't just efficient workers, they were friends who'd learned to trust each other with their lives in darkness where mistakes meant death. These weren't expenses. They were Patrick and William and John and Antonio. They were fathers and brothers and sons. They were human beings who descended daily into danger while Morrison had sat in climate-controlled comfort pretending their suffering was necessary, inevitable, beyond his control. The first drops of rain struck Morrison's face. He looked up. Storm clouds had gathered during the afternoon, dark and heavy with the promise of relief. The scorching heat wave that had gripped Silver Creek for weeks was finally breaking. Rain fell harder, washing dust from Morrison's face, from his filthy clothes, from hands that had gripped rock and timber and cage rails in genuine fear. He stood in the downpour, letting it cleanse what it could, knowing some stains ran deeper than water could reach. Katherine emerged from the equipment shed, having returned her gear. She stood beside Morrison in the rain, waiting without speaking, giving him space to process what he'd witnessed. "I'll implement every recommendation you've made," Morrison said finally. "Your board will object," Katherine replied. "Costs will rise. Production may drop initially while changes are implemented. Are you prepared for that resistance?" Morrison thought of Patrick's weathered face, of Robert Collier's 4 children, of the 19-year-old swinging his pick in suffocating heat. He thought of 15 years of comfortable distance and what that distance had cost in lives and suffering. "Some things matter more than quarterly reports," he said. Katherine studied him, perhaps judging whether his commitment would survive contact with financial pressure and board opposition. Morrison didn't blame her skepticism. He'd given her no reason for trust. "I'll need a week to compile my full recommendations," she said. "Timber replacement schedules, ventilation improvements, shift hour reductions, safety equipment upgrades. It will be comprehensive." "I want comprehensive," Morrison said. "I want everything that should have been done 15 years ago." "That's a significant investment. Then we'll make it." Morrison turned to face her fully. "I can't undo the past, can't bring back the men who died because I was too frightened to see what I was asking of them. But I can change what happens next." It wasn't dramatic conversion, no lightning strike of sudden virtue. Morrison felt no transcendent clarity, no spiritual awakening. He simply understood with sober certainty that his previous approach had been unconscionable, and continuing it would compound moral failure into something worse. Katherine nodded slowly. "I'll begin drafting recommendations tonight." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mr. Morrison, implementation will be harder than you imagine. Change always is. She adjusted her equipment and prepared to leave. But if you're serious about this, truly serious, then Silver Creek could become a model for safe operations throughout Colorado territory. She walked away through the rain, leaving Morrison standing outside the mine entrance. Workers passed by, glancing at their owner covered in filth and standing in the downpour like a man who'd forgotten how to seek shelter. Morrison looked down at his ruined clothes, his scraped hands, the dust and grime that no amount of rain could fully wash away. He thought of his immaculate office, the cold hearth, the pristine ledgers that had insulated him from the human consequences of his decisions. He'd descended into the earth this morning as one kind of man. He surfaced this evening as someone different, or perhaps someone finally confronting who he'd actually been all along. The rain fell harder, cooling and cleansing and marking the end of one season and the beginning of something uncertain but necessary. Morrison stood in it, getting thoroughly soaked, and made a simple promise to men who would never know they'd been heard. No more distance, no more comfortable ignorance, no more treating human beings as acceptable losses in pursuit of profit. The work of change would begin tomorrow, tonight. Morrison simply stood in breaking rain and acknowledged the weight of what needed to be done. 1 year later, Morrison sat in the same second-floor office, but everything had changed. The cold hearth now contained a small fire despite summer warmth, symbolic rekindling that Morrison tended personally each morning. The flames offered no practical purpose in July heat, but they reminded him of commitments made and kept, of promises that required daily renewal. His desk no longer held pristine ledgers showing maximum profits extracted through minimum expenditure. Instead, documents covered the mahogany surface accident reports, safety inspection logs, efficiency studies, hospital fund receipts. Morrison reviewed them each morning with the attention he'd once reserved for quarterly margins. The accident report showed Silver Creek's transformation in stark numbers: 73% reduction in injuries over 12 months, 365 days without a fatality, implementation of every recommendation Katherine had made. Plus additional improvements Morrison's monthly underground inspections had revealed. The board had opposed every change. 2 directors resigned within the first quarter. Citing Morrison's reckless disregard for fiduciary responsibility, investors threatened to withdraw capital. Morrison's response had been simple and unwavering. Find other investments. Production had dropped 18% in the first 3 months, while changes were implemented: new timber supports, expanded ventilation shafts, reduced shift hours from 12 to 8. Costs had surged. Quarterly reports showed losses that made Morrison's business colleagues question his sanity. But Morrison had held firm, trusting Katherine's expertise and Patrick's testimony over spreadsheet projections. He'd weathered the criticism, the threats, the accusation that he was destroying everything his father had built. The vindication came gradually, then overwhelmingly. Rested workers outproduced exhausted ones. Healthy miners made fewer mistakes. Better ventilation meant clearer thinking and faster, safer work. Reduced accidents meant lower insurance premiums and no costly production halts for rescue operations. By month 9, production had recovered to previous levels. By month 12, it exceeded them. The efficiency studies on Morrison's desk proved what Katherine had insisted: caring for people wasn't charity. It was sound business practice and basic human decency. Morrison had become something of a curiosity among Colorado Territory mine owners. Some dismissed him as eccentric. Others studied his methods with cautious interest. Katherine's technical journal article, published in October, had attracted attention from mining operations throughout the western states. Patrick O'Brien now served as Chief Safety Inspector, a newly created position Morrison had insisted on. Patrick received a salary competitive with mine management, and specifically to ensure he couldn't be intimidated or influenced. His job was simple: challenge every decision, question every cost-cutting measure, and ensure that Silver Creek never again sacrificed human safety for profit margins. Morrison descended into the mine monthly, now still fighting claustrophobia each time, still uncomfortable in the heat and darkness, but refusing to lead from ignorant distance. The miners had noticed. Respect wasn't given freely, but Morrison felt it being earned through sustained action rather than empty promises. The 3 men from the original collapse had survived. Pulled from the rubble after 16 hours of desperate rescue work, Morrison had visited their families personally. Apologizing for his inadequate initial response, the apology couldn't erase past negligence, but it acknowledged truth. 2 of the men had returned to work. The third, whose injuries prevented underground labor, now worked in the equipment shop at full wages. Morrison had established a precedent. Silver Creek took care of its workers, even when they could no longer perform their original duties. A knock at the door interrupted Morrison's review. Gerald entered with the afternoon mail. "Quarterly report for the board, sir, and a letter from the Colorado School of Mines." Morrison opened the letter first. Katherine was accepting a professorship, teaching mining engineering with emphasis on safety protocols. Her final consultation visit to Silver Creek would be next week. She'd written, "You've exceeded my expectations. Mr. Morrison, Silver Creek has become what I hoped it might, proof that profitable mining and humane treatment aren't mutually exclusive." Morrison smiled, filing the letter carefully. He'd miss Katherine's quarterly visits, her sharp assessments, her refusal to accept comfortable lies, but her work here was done. Silver Creek had internalized the lessons she'd taught. He moved to the window, the same window where he'd stood a year ago, watching families gather in grief. Now he saw the evening shift emerging. Men clean and relatively fresh after 8-hour shifts instead of the exhausting 12-hour marathons they'd once endured. A young miner, Morrison recognized him now. Knew his name was Thomas. Knew he'd just become a father. Looked up at the office window and waved. Not a deferential gesture, but casual acknowledgement. Human connection across vertical distance that no longer felt like moral separation. Morrison waved back. No longer separated by glass and elevation and willful ignorance. The mine still ran. Profits still mattered. They had to, for the operation to continue. But now Morrison understood that sustainable profits came from sustainable practices, and sustainable practices required treating workers as human beings rather than operational expenses. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Outside, summer heat pressed down on Silver Creek. Below, in tunnels Morrison now knew intimately, men worked in improved conditions with adequate support, proper ventilation, and reasonable hours. Not perfect, the earth still held dangers beyond human control, but better, measurably, undeniably better. Morrison returned to his desk and opened the quarterly report. The numbers told their story. Silver Creek Mine. Profitable and safe, proving that an owner willing to descend into darkness could lead from genuine understanding rather than comfortable distance. He'd been given a second chance, unearned, undeserved, but offered nonetheless by men generous enough to accept change when it finally came. Morrison intended to honor that gift through sustained commitment, not grand gestures, through monthly descents and daily oversight. Through timber replaced on schedule and ventilation maintained properly, and 8-hour shifts that allowed men to return home with energy enough to embrace their families. The mine had always been his legacy. Now it would be a legacy worth leaving, built not on maximum extraction and minimum cost, but on the simple principle that men who descend into darkness deserve an owner willing to do the same. Morrison gathered the quarterly report and prepared for the evening board meeting. They would question his continued safety investments. They would push for reduced costs and increased margins, and Morrison would remind them, as he had every quarter for the past year, that some things mattered more than numbers on pages. The men who made those numbers possible, the families who depended on them, the fundamental dignity that every human being deserved, regardless of where they stood in the vertical hierarchy of ownership and labor. Morrison left his office as daylight faded. The small fire still burning in the hearth he'd once kept cold. Outside, Silver Creek bustled with its usual evening activity, miners heading home, families gathering for supper, children playing in streets no longer shadowed by constant grief. The mine had not changed. The mountains still held its silver. The earth still demanded its price for yielding treasure. But the man who owned it had transformed entirely, and in that transformation, everything else had followed.